Vikings invade Paris. The siege that terrified Europe 845 AD. The year is 845. The Seine is a gray serpent, coiling through a city that prays louder than it sleeps. Dawn fog presses low, so thick a man could carve his name in it with a knife. From the mist comes the sound first oars striking water in perfect rhythm. Wood-biting river, men breathing like a single animal. Then the shapes appear, long and lean, prows carved as dragons, 120 ships gliding without a splash. Paris watches in silence. Priests clutch relics. Merchants hide their coin. Soldiers grip spears that sweat in their hands. The man at the lead ship has a name. The Franks whisper more than they speak Ragnar. He smiles without warmth. He points toward the city that believes itself protected by God and by walls. Here is the first tale people forget. On this very approach, one Frankish army broke and ran before the river had even finished echoing their war cry. And here is the second, colder truth. The price to spare Paris would soon be counted not in lives, but in silver 7,000 pounds of it. Yet this morning, standing at the water's edge, no one knows which will be demanded. A bell begins to toll. 1, 2, 3, and then, mid-ring, it stops. River afire. The fleet in the fog and the first collapse. The Vikings ride the Seine toward Paris. The Frankish forward army falters. And the city hears the bell that never finishes, ringing. Chapter 2. Wolves at the gate. Good Friday. Broken courage and the doors of Paris. The Vikings test the crossings, burn the margins, and force Paris to choose between martyrdom and survival. Chapter 3. The bargain of the bald king. Diplomacy with a sword at its throat. Charles the Bald measures pride against coin while his counselors argue. And a city counts the cost of time. Chapter 4. Smoke over the saints, the sacking, the silence and the sacred ruin. Fire licks the rafters. Relics vanish, and the psychology of fear becomes the Vikings' deadliest weapon. Chapter 5. Silver for a shadow. The tribute paid and the ghost it leaves. 7,000 pounds change hands. The river empties of dragons. And Europe learns a lesson. It will pay again and again. Chapter 1. River of fire. The fleet in the fog and the first collapse. The Seine holds its breath as the first prow noses through the fog. Oak ribs creak. Tarred rope hums. The men on the benches pull as if the river itself has a heartbeat they intend to steal. Paris is a priver, just out of sight, but the city's fear has already traveled downstream, thin as smoke and just as real. On the lead ship, Ragnar stands easy, one hand on the dragon's neck. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. His men know that silence is a weapon. Let the river speak for them. On the banks, Frankish scouts watch and whisper counts they can hardly believe. 50, 60, 100. More. They run to tell their captain and find him staring at the water as if it has given up every secret but one, the one that matters. Will these ships pass like a storm, or will they stop and unmake the day? The Vikings do not pass. They draw into the reeds where the current stalls, and they eat in the boats, cold meat in colder air. Shields hang like wet moons on the gunwales. A raven circles once and vanishes into the mist. It means nothing to a Frank. It means everything to a Dane. Ragnar raises a hand. The fleet angles back toward the middle and slips forward again, a knife at the city's belly. He has chosen the hour when prayers are loudest and swords are farthest from hands. The oars come up together, then dip, then rise. Rhythm does what drums would do. Heartbeats sync with wood. Most people never knew this detail. The first clash never happens at the walls of Paris. It happens when a Frankish force drawn up to block the river's throat sees those hulls multiply out of the fog and feels courage thin like a winter sun. The Vikings cut toward them in 2 files, fast as fish, then break, then merge, as if the river itself obeys their will. Shields rise and the world narrows to breath and plank. Arrows hiss. One finds a Viking's shoulder. He grunts, digs his oar deeper, and keeps pace. Another strikes a Frankish captain's cheek and disappears into the man behind him. The captain spits blood onto his own collar and tries to shout. The sound comes out as a question. Ragnar's ship spears the gap. A spray of river water hits the Frankish front line. The first Viking over the gunwale lands like a thrown axe. He doesn't scream. He doesn't need to. The shock is sound enough. He smashes a shield rim into a face, feels teeth go under the iron, pivots, and opens a man from hip to hope. The line wavers, then buckles. And this is where everything changed. Not with a broken gate, not with a burning church, but with a thought that spread faster than fire. If we stand here, we die here. One rank steps back. The men behind them feel the step and take another. The river sucks at their boots as if it is helping them choose. On the lead ship, Ragnar watches a single Frank draw breath to rally his men. He respects that breath. He allows it. The Viking next to him does not. The axe falls, and with it, the gathering roar. The sound drains out of the Frankish line as quickly as the color drains from the river foam. But here's the shocking truth. The Vikings don't press to annihilate. Not yet. They press to scatter. Terror is a river you can steer if you understand its bends. The Franks turn, some stumbling, some flinging shields, some trying to swim back across their own fear. The Vikings let them. A city defended by men who have run once is a city that negotiates. The bell in Paris, the one that began and failed to finish, finds its voice again late off. Wrong. The sound tells the city 2 things at once. Danger is here, and no, we are not ready. This first collapse is the first payoff. The forward guard is broken. The road to Paris is open. And now, before we step inside those half-lit gates together, I have something to ask. If you want history told like this alive, unblinking, and honest, subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments which ancient siege you want us to unleash next. You're about to hear what most histories whisper and few dare to say out loud. The Vikings move upriver. Rowing as if they have stolen time. The men sing under their breath, a low animal sound that carries no melody, only intent. On both banks, farmsteads watch hope turn into smoke. Doors are barred, then unbarred, then left open in surrender to whatever the morning has planned. Paris draws closer, and with it, the great question that cities always ask when war comes up their street. Do we fight to be remembered, or do we pay to survive? Ragnar counts the bridges without moving his lips. He has seen cities that trusted wood more than courage. He has burned both. Scouts fan ahead in smaller boats, sliding into coves and out again, like knives tasting meat. One returns with news that makes the older men nod. The river turns gently just before Paris. That bend is a curtain. Behind it, you can disappear. Behind it, you can arrive everywhere at once. He orders the oars in. The fleet glides until the current threatens to own them. Then oars dip again 3 strokes. Stop, listen. The city's sound reaches them in fragments. A child crying. A mule braying. A priest trying to make his voice larger than the morning. The wind changes and brings the smell of fresh bread. The men grin. Men who can smell bread will soon smell fear. Most people never knew this detail. The Frankish world is split not only by river and road, but by loyalty. Some lords look to Charles the Bald and see a king. Others see a young man wearing a crown that doesn't quite fit. Messages have gone out in the night: call to arms, call to prayer, call to calculation. Not every message has returned with an answer. This is how a city can be strong and weak at once. On the north bank, a handful of horsemen appear and then hold, unsure if the fog hides one ship or a forest of them. A Viking at the bow stands, draws a bowstring back to his ear, and studies the space between two of the horse's ears, not as a target, but as a choice. He lets the bowstring whisper forward and sends his arrow into the air. High, useless, on purpose. It lands behind the horses. The animals flinch, and the men curse. The Vikings laugh gently to themselves. Psychology fights cheaper than steel. The fleet halts in a broadening of the river where reeds make a thin green crown. Ragnar turns his head just enough to look at the men around him. Paris, he says, the word made of stone. We knock. If they open, we walk. If they do not, we teach. It is not bravado. It is weather. But fate had something else planned. As the fleet shifts to reform, a black cross appears on the water ahead. A squat timber planted in the riverbed, a poor man's barrier against dragons. Then another, and another. The Franks had begun to seed the current with crude stakes meant to tear open a hull and drown a ship before a sword is ever drawn. The Vikings see it and change nothing about their faces. Ragnar lifts a hand and traces a curve in the air. The fleet mirrors it. Men rowing with one oar, then the other, as if dancing with a partner determined to step on their toes. The first ship slides between the first two stakes with inches to spare. The second kisses one with a sound like a drum, then slips on, bruised but unbroken. The third catches just a touch, just enough to remind every man on board that the river is an enemy too. And this is where everything changed again. The Franks watching from the bank had wagered on wood and hope. They see their trap fail in slow motion and understand that the city is closer to the Vikings than the Vikings are to fear. One rider wheels his horse and kicks for the gate. The others follow. The Vikings follow them with their eyes, already imagining the echo that hooves will make on stone. Paris rises now. Less a city than a collection of prayers soaked into wood and mortar. The walls are not the walls of later centuries. They are stern, but human. The gates are firm, but the men behind them are tired. The Vikings take in the angles like a carpenter measuring a room for a table. Where does the light fall? Where does it hide? Where do men gather when they lie to themselves? Ragnar steps onto the riverbank without ceremony. Mud sucks at his boot. He looks up at the gate and imagines it open. He listens to the wind and hears a bell that, this time, does not fail. It rings long and wild until the sound frays at the edges. If sound can sweat, this. Listen, Paris breathes like a hunted animal. The bell that faltered at dawn finds its voice and won't let go, and the river carries that panic down to the waiting prows. A strip of sunlight cuts through the fog and paints the dragons' heads in a thin, cold gold. On the bank, a boy drops a loaf of bread and doesn't bend to pick it up. Somewhere, a door slams and a prayer collides with a curse. The city is awake, and the wolves have already tested the fence. Ragnar stands with one foot on the gunwale and watches the water the way a man studies a face he intends to deceive. The Seine narrows before the Isle de la Cite, and two bridges brace the island like clenched teeth. He knows bridges are not just wood. They are throats. Squeeze them, and a city can't breathe. He raises his arm, and the fleet peels into two lines. Oars lifting, feathering, settling, every blade catching the pale light as if the river wears scales. On the left bank, smoke begins thin, then thicker as Viking parties run light through farmyards and storehouses. Not waste. A signal. Every column of smoke says the same thing in a language older than the Franks. Your walls cannot keep the fire out of your lungs. On the right bank, a knot of Frankish infantry forms behind a hedge. They've chosen ground, which means they have chosen to be found. Ragnar nods once, and 3 boats slip toward them, shallow keels whispering through weed and mud. The Franks hold their breath, thinking invisibility lives in hedges. It never has. The first Viking into the gap doesn't slow. He goes at the hedge like a man late for the truth. He tears it open with his shield, thorns scraping wood and leather, and the men behind him pour through. For a hot heartbeat, there is only breath and bark and iron. A Frank swings and catches a shoulder, hears the sound of wood splitting, and thinks it is bone. He learns his mistake when the same shield breaks his nose. The hedge, so proud in its green, becomes a trap for the men it hoped to hide. But here's the shocking truth. They don't stay. They break the little line, scatter it like grain, and then leave the field without a cheer. Fear grows best when you don't harvest it too soon. The men in the city shadow see their neighbors run, and the idea takes root. If we fight today, we fight alone. The bell hammers, the air grows warmer with smoke, and the river keeps its slow animal smile. Noon drifts over the masts. The fog thins, and Paris shows its bone-sturdy walls, sagging roofs, the heavy shoulders of churches. A procession trembles through a side street toward the water, banners held high, carried by men who have not slept. For a moment, the river hushes, as if even pagan oars are curious. At the front, a priest holds a cross taller than himself. He stops at the bank and lifts his voice until it shreds. He speaks not to Ragnar, but to heaven, demanding a wall no man can climb. He gets wind. Ragnar watches the man's mouth shape words and sees what the city has chosen: spectacle for courage. He respects the tactic. He has used its mirror all morning. A spear arcs from somewhere no one will later admit to throwing 10 punches into the priest's banner. The cloth sags. The line behind him stumbles. The banner-bearer tries to lift again, fails, then kneels to keep it off the dirt. The Vikings do not laugh. They do not need to. The river carries the moment into memory. By mid-afternoon, the bridges glower above the water, and men crowd their spans with spears and curses. Chains slung under the beams sway, and for the first time, the fleet shifts as if feeling a hand on its throat. Those chains are meant to stop boats. They will not stop what the boats carry. Ragnar looks down the length of the lead ship and sees his men turn inside themselves, preparing to move without breath when breath becomes expensive. Split, he says, and the word ripples through the fleet without touching the air again. Half the ships tack for the right bank, looking to slip into the smaller channels that braid around the island. The others angle for the left, keeping the bridges busy, forcing eyes left while steel moves right. It is a trick as old as hunger. Paris falls for it because every city does. The first turning point is the foolish one. A Frankish captain on the left bridge decides to be the story's hero. He brings men onto the span to throw back the boats with poles and firepots, knowing, loving even, the wayward fear's flame. He gets close enough to see the Vikings' faces. He finds them as calm as stones. He lifts a pot in both hands, and a shaft strikes the clay, and his own fire eats him. He runs 3 steps and dives for the river. But the chains catch him like a net and hold him under while his men shout his name. The pot, knocked from his hands, arcs gently down into a Viking boat and rolls. And a man picks it up, looks at it, and drops it into the river with a little nod. The way you would discard a cup when you've had your drink. The bridge learns a lesson it forgets by evening. Behind the right bridge, the other half of the fleet ghosts into a smaller channel. Oars taken in, poles whispering along the bed. They are almost under the beams before the first shout finds them. Stones drop. One strikes a helmet and turns it into a ringing room. Another tears the cheek off a man who doesn't stop moving. A log shoved from the bridge lands at an angle and punches a hole in a hull. For a heartbeat, the ship seems to decide between drowning and fury. It chooses fury. Men move cargo, shift weight, slap tar-soaked wool into the wound as if dressing a living thing. The hull survives. The log rolls and bounces into the current and goes behind them like a bad idea they refuse to keep. What happened next? No historian expected. The wind turns against Paris. Smoke that might have drifted out over the river folds back into the streets. Eyes sting. Voices crack. Signal flags on the walls lose their words. Inside the city, fire jumps alleys the way men jump fear. And suddenly the city's defenders have to battle one against the ships, one against their own roofs. The Vikings didn't ask the wind for help, but they accept it like a gift that arrives without a name. Evening leans in. The bell grows hoarse and drops into silence between frantic bursts. A rumor moves faster than men. The king is coming. Charles the Bald pulls a threadbare army along the road like a man dragging furniture in a house that's already burning. Some swear they saw his banner at St. Denis. Others say he waits, counting, praying to the only god kings ever really served time. The Vikings don't fear banners. They fear boredom. They move. At dusk, a small party slips across the shallows below the right bridge where the current hesitates. Cloaks turned inside out, shields left behind, axes wrapped in cloth. They look like merchants who've lost their way. A gate stands open for air, not men. A boy and an old soldier share a stool, passing a wineskin back and forth, arguing in the low, lazy way of people who believe night is a wall. The first Viking is close enough to see the boy's smile. He thinks of his own son and hates himself for the thought. He passes anyway. They reach the shadow of the gate's jaw before a dog wakes. It doesn't bark. It stands and stares, ears forward, body rigid with the certainty that the air has changed. The old soldier follows the dog's eyes and sees men with the wrong kind of quiet. He doesn't scream. He lunges. The boy drops the wineskin and scrambles for the rope that lifts the inner bar. Fingers fumbling at knots, a sober man could have handled in a blink. A Viking goes for him and trips on the wineskin, slides in the spill, and hits stone hard enough to taste blood and old grapes. The old soldier swings a spear with the lazy grace of a man who has done this all his life and opens a man's throat without ceremony. And this is where everything changed, not because the gate fell, but because it didn't. The dog barks once, but the sound is a bell. It ricochets through the street, wakes a house, wakes a street, wakes a city that had been pretending the night would keep it safe. Shutters slam. Feet thump on stairs. The little party melts back toward the water, silent now in the way animals are when they quit a kill they almost had. The boy slumps against the wall, wine at his feet like spilled blood. The old soldier listens to the river and spits, not from disgust, but to tell himself he still owns this mouth. The climax of the day comes not with fire, but with sound. From the south, beyond the bend that hides the king, horns speak in a language no Viking understands, and every Viking recognizes someone is trying to find courage with noise. The fleet draws together like wolves, meeting their eyes in the dark. Ragnar steps to the bow, and the men nearest him feel the air change as if the river has decided to pay attention. Across the water, a new fire appears, torches moving in lines, reflections chopping to pieces on the ripples. The Franks have arrived not to fight yet, but to be seen. To tell the city that tomorrow is not hopeless. If hope alone were iron, the river would have filled with swords. Most people never knew this detail. The king's first act is not in order to attack, but in order to divide. He splits his force across both banks, thinking to trap the fleet against the island and the bridges, to close the river like a fist. The move makes sense. It also makes a mistake that can only be made by men who have never sat in Viking boats. They forget that the river has 3 dimensions, and the Vikings own a 4th timing. 2 hours can make a map into a lie. Night closes, soft at first, then heavy and absolute. The horns stop. The bell is done. Somewhere in the dark, a woman sings to a child, and for a few heartbeats, the world shrinks to a single, dirty lullaby. Ragnar sits on the dragon's neck and rubs resin between thumb and forefinger. The sun rose red that morning, not a royal red, but the raw color of iron left too long in blood. The wind had changed again, sliding cold down the river, carrying the smell of wet ash and rot. Paris woke beneath it, half praying, half listening. From the towers, the guards saw motion on the water, lines of ships still anchored, their shields now glinting in ordered rows. The Vikings had not fled in the night. They had slept within reach of the walls. Ragnar's men moved quietly, mending oars, sharpening blades on whetstones that hissed like snakes. No drums, no boasting. The silence itself was the weapon. They had seen what came next too many times, a city trying to believe in its gods. Before meeting the men who didn't, Ragnar walked the deck like a man measuring a grave. His gaze lingered on the towers of the island church. He could almost hear the echo of the last bell, still trembling in the stone. Inside those walls, Charles the Bald had finally arrived. The king's cloak was heavy with damp, his crown dull. He had ridden through villages that burned behind him. Now he stood within walls that smelled of smoke from his own fields. Advisors pressed in close, muttering of ransom, of pride, of God's test. Charles listened, but his eyes fixed on the river. He saw not ships, but hunger, and he knew hunger always eats what it finds. But fate had something else planned. From the cathedral came the chant of monks' thin voices, rising like birds that could not find the sky. The people crowded the squares, begging for miracles. Yet the miracle came from the river, a strange stillness. The water, restless all night, suddenly lay flat as polished steel. The Vikings took it as a sign. So did the priests. Only one of them was right. At Ragnar's signal, the fleet split again, this time wider, stretching past the city's flanks. Fire arrows tipped with pitch streaked upward, slow at first, then faster, each trailing a thread of smoke that drew the eye higher than safety allowed. One struck a granary roof. Another found the hayloft near the Saint-Germain gate. The city's defenders ran to douse flames with buckets, leaving the bridges thin. That was the mistake Ragnar waited for. He lifted his hand. And the drums began. Not loud, just enough to remind the river that it had a heartbeat. Oars bit the surface, and the ships moved like predators rising from sleep. The first chain beneath the bridge snapped under the push of 3 hulls joined by rope. The noise was not metal breaking. It was the sound of every plan the Franks had made collapsing in a single breath. And this is where everything changed. The Vikings surged forward, their prow shields clanging against the bridge piles. Arrows rained from above, black silhouettes against the red light, but too high, too hurried. One arrow found Ragnar's arm. He looked at it, twisted it free, and kept rowing. The blood on his sleeve looked almost ceremonial. From the city wall, a priest screamed a warning, pointing to the river bend. Too late. The Vikings had set a drift barrel stuffed with tar and oil, their sides already aflame. They bumped the bridge supports and burst like rotten fruit. Fire crawled upward, licking the beams. The men on the bridge felt heat underfoot before they saw the flames. Some jumped. Some prayed. None stayed. Most people never knew this detail. The Vikings didn't storm the bridge to cross. They burned it to divide. The island, once the heart of Paris, became a trap, a patch of stone surrounded by wrath. With one bridge gone and the other groaning under flame, the Franks could not bring aid from the banks. Charles' army watched from one side, helpless as their own city began to burn in circles. Smoke wrapped the towers. Bells melted into silence. Still, Ragnar did not order the final assault. He waited for fear to ferment. His men gathered spoils from the suburbs, dragging carts of grain, barrels of wine, relics torn from chapels. On the riverbank, they built pyres. Not for the dead, but for message. A warning carved in fire: pay or perish. The king's council broke that night. Some cried for vengeance, others for negotiation. Charles stared into the flames reflected on the water and saw his own crown shaking in it. He knew the Franks could not rebuild the bridges, nor starve an army that owned the river. So he sent riders, white-flagged, trembling, to the river's edge. Ragnar received them in silence. They spoke of faith, of peace, of ransom. He spoke only once: silver weighs less than blood. Choose which you will carry. But fate had one more twist. As the messengers rowed back toward the gates, the sickness that had begun in the fleet reached the shore. Men staggered, coughing, faces pale under the soot. Within days, the same cough echoed through the city. Neither side knew who carried it first, only that the river carried it best. The truce stretched thin under fever. The Franks counted silver. The Vikings counted the dead. Rain came, washing blood and ash together into the Seine. The bridges were gone. The air stank of smoke and sickness, and still neither army moved. Then, one night, under a moon smothered by clouds, the bells rang again 3 times, slow, deliberate. Not alarm, summons. On the southern wall, a single torch waved in pattern. A gate creaked open, and that's where we leave them. Ragnar standing on the riverbank, the king waiting in the dark, and a city that must decide before dawn whether its soul is worth more than its silver. The river, as always, keeps its secret until morning. The morning broke with no sun, just a sullen light leaking through smoke that hung over the river like a shroud. The Seine was quieter now, almost reverent, as if it, too, waited to see what men would do next. Half of Paris smoldered behind its walls. The rest crouched under prayer. From the north bank, the Vikings stood watching, faces pale beneath streaks of soot and ash. They had come for silver, for glory, for the name Ragnar to echo across kingdoms, but the river had taken something from them, too. Men coughed behind shields. One collapsed by the fire, blood darkening his lips. The sickness moved faster than steel, and it didn't care for courage. Ragnar knelt beside the man, pressed 2 fingers to his throat. Then looked at the sky, a silent question to gods who never answered in words. On the opposite bank, Charles the Bald had seen the same thing. His own soldiers were falling, not from wounds, but from whatever curse the river carried. The king's priests called it divine justice. His captains called it bad luck. But Charles saw an opening. The Vikings might die before they ever breached the walls. If he could just wait long enough. But here's the shocking truth. The Vikings were not the ones growing weaker. The Franks, trapped behind their gates, were starving. Grain stores had burned. The bridges lay broken. And what food remained spoiled in the damp? The people whispered that God had turned away, that the relics they'd prayed to had lost their power. Each night the chanting grew softer until even the bells sounded afraid to speak. Our Agine are understood patience. He had seen cities rot before, swords touched them. But Paris was proud, and pride, he knew, was a wall thicker than any stone. He would have to break it another way. That night, he called his captains to the shore. Around them, the pyres hissed in the drizzle, throwing smoke that bent with the wind. Ragnar's eyes caught the firelight. His voice was low, heavy with exhaustion and resolve. We've shown them death. Now we show them silence. At dawn the next day, the fleet went still. No shouts, no horns, no fire. The ships lay on the river like sleeping beasts. From the walls, Paris watched and waited, unsure whether to hope or fear. Days passed. The silence became unbearable. Traders who had hidden in cellars crept out and found the Viking camps empty. The king's scouts rode cautiously along the shore, finding only ashes and footprints. Word spread, the Vikings had gone. The city exhaled. Bells rang again, not in alarm this time, but in triumph. Priests declared victory. Charles proclaimed deliverance. The people came out to the squares, weeping, laughing, believing they had been spared by heaven. And this is where everything changed. 3 days later, as the city celebrated, smoke appeared upriver, faint at first, then thick, black, and fast-moving. The Vikings had not left. They had only sailed around the bend to strike from the other side. Before the bells could ring a warning, they were already upon the southern walls. The assault was brutal, swift, merciless. Fire roared through the wooden markets outside the gates. The defenders scrambled to form ranks, but exhaustion made cowards of their feet. Ragnar himself led the charge, axe in hand, cloak torn, voice cutting through the noise like thunder. "Paris," he shouted, "you prayed for mercy. I am the answer you were given." The gates groaned under impact. Arrows sang from the towers, but the Vikings climbed over burning carts, using flame itself as their ladder. One Frankish captain tried to hold the breach, shouting for the king's banner, but a javelin took him through the chest. Pinning him to the gate he swore to protect. Inside the walls, chaos turned to collapse. Women fled through alleys with children pressed against their chests. Monks carried relics toward the cathedral, but the smoke swallowed their path. Charles, watching from the palace window, saw the fire devour the lower quarter and felt his throne tremble beneath him. He called for his council, only half came by nightfall. Paris was a storm of light and screams. The Vikings poured through the broken gate, their shadows flickering on the walls like the ghosts of every raid before them. But this time, even Ragnar seemed changed. He did not smile when his men shouted victory. He moved through the streets with a strange quiet, eyes lingering not on the spoils, but on the faces terrified, human, defeated. Most people never knew this detail. When the cathedral doors burst open, Ragnar did not enter. He stood at the threshold, watching the priests clutch their crosses, and then he turned away. "Take the silver," he said. "Leave their prayers." The fighting slowed. The fire ate what it could, then died in the rain. When dawn came, Paris was half ruins, half miracle, still standing, but hollow. The king had no army left, no bridges, no will. Only his treasury remained. Charles met Ragnar at the river's edge. Between them lay a single plank of charred wood, what was left of the bridge that once connected them. The king spoke first, his voice hoarse. "You came for silver. Take it and leave my city." Ragnar studied him for a long moment. The man before him was no coward, only tired of pretending to be a king. "You will pay," Ragnar said. "Not because I demand it, but because fear does." And so it was agreed. 7,000 pounds of silver, the heaviest piece Paris would ever buy. Yet, as the treasure was loaded, rain began to fall again. Soft at first, then relentless. The coins clinked like the echoes of chains, and every Frank who watched knew the truth. This was not victory. It was ransom. The Vikings set sail that evening, their ships heavy, the river gleaming with reflected fire. Behind them, Paris lay wounded but alive, a city spared, not saved, but fate had something else planned. As the fleet drifted downriver, a sudden shout rose from the rear ships. One hull lurched, struck by something unseen. The men peered overboard. There, in the dark water, dozens of shapes moved beneath them, not fish, not logs, but corpses. The swollen dead carried by the current from upriver, the Seine. The witness to their triumph had become their grave. The sickness, silent and patient, had followed them. Ragnar looked at the floating dead and knew. The river never forgets who disturbs its peace. He turned his face toward the open sea. And the rain hid whether what rolled down his cheek was water or something else. The ships vanished into the mist, their drums fading, leaving only one question echoing along the Seine. If gold can buy peace, why does the river still whisper of war? And somewhere in the ashes of Paris, a new bell was cast, one forged from melted silver, to remind the living of the price they once paid for survival. The river looked calm that morning, but beneath the stillness lay everything that had happened. Blood, ash, sickness, silver. The Seine carried it all, whispering through the reeds like a secret too heavy to drown. The Vikings' fleet had vanished down its bends, their prows swallowed by mist, their songs replaced by the soft rasp of the tide. Paris had survived, though no one inside its walls could say what survival truly meant. Charles the Bald stood atop the ruined tower of St. Denis and watched the smoke curl across his city. The wind carried the faint stench of burned wheat and pitch, the smell of ransom paid too late. Around him, courtiers tried to speak of rebuilding, of fortifications, of lessons learned. The king said nothing. His crown felt heavier than the silver he had given away. "They're gone," one of his priests whispered. "No," Charles said quietly. "They've only learned what our fear costs." Downriver, Ragnar's ships cut through the fog, the dragon heads rising and falling like tired beasts. The treasure weighed them low, silver packed in barrels and sacks, coins glimmering when sunlight broke through. Some men laughed, others coughed. The sickness had not left them. It rode with them, silent, patient. Ragnar sat at the bow, his cloak wrapped tight, eyes on the horizon. He had won the city bent, the king paid, the world would whisper his name. Yet victory felt hollow, like drinking from a cup lined with ash. His men sang behind him, but their voices wavered, thinner than before. But here's the shocking truth. The silver that Paris paid 7,000 pounds was not the end. It was the beginning of something Europe would come to know all too well, the art of paying peace. Every kingdom that heard the tale learned the same fear, and with fear came imitation. Gold for silence, silver for mercy, tribute as strategy. Ragnar had not just plundered a city, he had changed the logic of kings. As the fleet neared the sea, a storm gathered on the horizon. Clouds moved like armies. Thunder rolled across the water. The men tightened ropes, lowered sails, muttered prayers to gods whose loyalty was as shifting as the wind. Ragnar stayed upright, face wet with rain. He thought of Paris, the walls glowing red in the night, the priest clutching his cross, the king's trembling hand over the treasure. He wondered if the Franks prayed for him or against him. The storm hit at dusk. Waves hammered the ships. Lightning split the sky in veins of fire. One hull cracked against a hidden rock, spilling men and silver into the dark. Another ship vanished entirely, swallowed by a wave taller than its mast. The fleet scattered, each captain fighting both sea and fate. Ragnar's own ship pitched so violently he had to lash himself to the mast. Around him, the men shouted the old chants not to drive fear away, but to make sure someone was still alive to hear it. And this is where everything changed. When dawn came, the storm was gone, and so were half the ships. The survivors drifted on a sea littered with planks, barrels, and the gleam of lost coins tumbling in the waves. The treasure that had bought peace now belonged to the ocean. Ragnar's ship limped northward, its oars broken, its crew coughing and silent. He stood alone at the prow and watched the coastline rise, green, gray, indifferent. Behind him, one of his men whispered, "Was it worth it?" Ragnar didn't answer. The wind carried the question away before he could. Most people never knew this detail. When Ragnar returned to Denmark, his name had already grown larger than his shadow. The tale of Paris made him a legend. The man who held a city's throat in his hand chose to squeeze only until silver fell out. Yet legends are poor company. Those who had followed him to glory returned home to empty halls and graves that no one tended. The sickness claimed more lives than the swords had. Ragnar walked among their pyres, and for the first time the sound of fire made him flinch. He remembered the bridge collapsing, the priest's chant breaking in the smoke, the boy at the gate clutching the rope. He remembered that he had once laughed in battle and realized he no longer could. That night he stood by the shore and threw a handful of silver into the sea. The coins disappeared with barely a ripple. "Take it back," he murmured. "It was never mine." But fate had something else planned. Months later, when Ragnar sailed again, this time east toward England, he carried no treasure, only stories. The sea was calmer, but he was not. In his dreams he saw Paris burning and the river whispering through the smoke. He saw the king's face, not in fear, but in understanding to men who had both paid for peace with something they could never replace. The English shores rose gray before him, their cliffs streaked with gulls and mist. His crew cheered. Ragnar only smiled faintly. "Another city," he said. Another prayer. He stepped ashore, knowing the tide would one day take him back, but not home. And so, on that blood-soaked river where kings bargained and gods stayed silent, a truth was forged sharper than any blade. Silver buys time, not safety. And no wall, no crown, no prayer will keep the sea from coming. The Seine flowed on, carrying its secret past the ruins and the churches, past the graves and the gold. To those who listened, it still whispered the same name, Ragnar. The man who made Paris tremble. The man who proved that even victory can taste like sorrow. And when the wind moves across the water just right, me swear they still hear it. Or striking in perfect rhythm, wood-biting river, men breathing as one. The ghosts of the north still rowing, chasing the sound of a bell that never finished ringing. The years rolled forward like the river itself, slow, constant, impossible to stop. Paris rebuilt, stone by stone, prayer by prayer. The scars of the siege remained etched into its soul-burned beams, blackened altars, and the memory of the dragon ships that had once ruled the Seine. The people spoke Ragnar's name not as a curse, but as a warning. What fear invites, power collects. The city learned to live differently after that year. The Franks strengthened their walls, forged thicker gates, and crowned new generals who studied not courage, but caution. The king, Charles the Bald, grew quieter with age. He still ruled, but the silver he had paid lived louder than any order he gave. His courtiers whispered that a king who buys peace can never again command it. And yet, from the ashes of that humiliation rose a new idea, one that would shape Europe itself. If gold could stop swords once, Charles thought, it could do so again. And so began the age of tribute. Kingdoms buying time, buying safety, buying illusions. What had started as Ragnar's ransom became a blueprint for survival. But here's the truth. Most people never knew while Paris healed. Ragnar never did. He sailed again, always chasing something unseen, as if the silence of that river still echoed inside him. England became his next fire, his next question to the gods. He raided its coasts with the same storm that had once haunted the Seine. Yet victory no longer burned, bright tit felt dim. Heavy, like memory repeating itself. Some nights his men said he would wake shouting not from nightmares, but from silence. Always the same words. The bell? Finish the bell. Smedo explained what it meant. On one of those nights, the sky burned with northern light, green and ghostly over the water. Ragnar stood alone at the bow, his hair whipped by the cold. He looked into the horizon as if it were an old enemy. "You can win 100 wars," he whispered to the wind, "and still lose the sound of peace." And this is where everything changed. Captured in the north of England, betrayed by politics sharper than any blade, Ragnar was thrown into a pit of serpents, a death meant to humiliate the man who had terrified kings. His enemies thought they had ended a pirate. They were wrong. They had birthed a myth. As the snakes coiled around him, Ragnar laughed a strange, low sound that frightened even the guards. "How the little piglets will grunt," he said, "when they hear how the old boar died." His last breath was not a scream. It was a promise. The story traveled faster than ships, faster than rivers. Across Europe, mothers hushed their children with his name. Warriors carved dragons into their shields. Kings dreamed of silver turning to blood. And every city that heard the tale of Paris understood that walls could not stop men who fought with belief instead of fear. But fate had one more twist. Decades later, when the Vikings came again, this time not to raid but to settle, the Franks no longer saw only savages. They saw the reflection of their own history, ambition, hunger, survival. The sons of Ragnar, Bjorn, Ivor, Sigurd would follow his path, carrying his fury, his legend, and his shadow. They would build what their father had burned. Most people never knew this detail. A single relic survived the 845 siege untouched. In the cathedral vault lay a silver bell, forged from coins that Paris had paid to Ragnar. When it rang, its tone was neither sorrow nor triumph, it was something in between. A sound that remembered both sides. Generations later, that bell was recast into the Great Bourdon of Notre Dame. Some said that when it rang on stormy nights, it carried another echo beneath it, a faint rhythm of oars, the whisper of a foreign tongue, the ghost of a name that once haunted the river. Ragnar, the man who made Europe's greatest city tremble. Not through cruelty, but through inevitability, the reminder that no empire, no faith, no wall can ever truly silence the will of those who dare the unknown. The Seine still flows, gray and patient. Its waters pass under bridges rebuilt, past towers reborn, past the ghosts of monks who once prayed against the tide. But if you stand on its banks at dawn, when the fog curls like smoke and the wind smells of salt, listen closely. You might hear its still oars striking water in perfect rhythm. Wood-biting river, men breathing as one, and a bell far away, finishing the ring it began the morning Ragnar came. The siege of Paris was not just a battle. It was a mirror held to human nature where faith met fear, and both paid the same price. Because in the end, no city falls forever, and no conqueror ever truly leaves. They remain in the stories, in the stones, in the river's whisper that never stops. They didn't fight for glory, the voice of the river says. They fought because they had no choice. And history, once again, waits for the next dawn, the next sound of oars, the next bell that dares to ring.